History as it happens, November 4th, 2021. New Deal or no deal?
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice.
I've long said compromise and consensus are the only way to get big things done in a democracy. Important things done for the country. I know it's hard. I know how deeply people feel about the things that they fight for. But this framework includes historic investments in our nation and in our people.
If a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, if the coronavirus pandemic threw into relief the social and economic ills plaguing American society, it appears our leaders may be ready to waste it, missing an opportunity to join those few moments in U.S. history when presidents and Congresses took vigorous action with progressive legislation. So will we have another New Deal or no deal, or maybe some kind of deal? That's next as we speak to David M. Kennedy as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is a recipe for economic crisis. None of us should ever misrepresent to the American people what the real cost of legislation is. While I've worked hard to find a path to compromise, it's obvious. Compromise is not good enough for a lot of my colleagues in Congress.
You can count on the fingers of one hand, I'd say, the moments. You don't even need all 5 digits. The moments in American history when we really had truly transformative political initiatives that came to pass and had lasting consequences.
March 4th, 1933. In his inaugural address, with his nation desperate for answers, a fourth of American workers unemployed, 5,000 banks had failed, Franklin Roosevelt delivered one of the most memorable lines in our history.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
4 years later, it appeared the worst of the Great Depression had lifted, and Roosevelt was less worried about fear as he began his second term. He was more concerned with complacency, as he put it, dulled conscience, irresponsibility, and ruthless self-interest already reappear.
Such symptoms of prosperity may become the portents of disaster. Prosperity already tests the persistence of our progressive purpose.
And just in case you didn't catch all of that, the audio is a little grainy. He said, prosperity already tests the persistence of our progressive purpose. I've thought of those words all year long from the moment President Biden, whose political pedigree is New Deal liberal, began pushing the most ambitious or expensive legislative agenda in a half-century.
Any single element of this framework would fundamentally be viewed as a fundamental change in America. Taken together, they're truly consequential.
In other words, we can't let the fact that we're emerging from the worst part of the pandemic-induced slowdown to distract us from a larger purpose. Or, as Roosevelt put it in 1937,
our pledge was not merely to do a patchwork job with second-hand materials. By using the new materials of social justice, we have undertaken to erect on the old foundation a more enduring structure for the better use of future generations.
Those words, a more enduring structure, structural reforms, were the most important parts of the New Deal because they're what lasted. Now, we should note there are some obvious major differences between then and now. We're not in a depression today, great or otherwise. We don't have double-digit unemployment, and the stock market is trading at record highs. FDR also enjoyed huge majorities in Congress. But if we're to believe public opinion polls, President Biden's social safety net, climate, and infrastructure agendas are popular. They wouldn't make nearly as many fundamental changes to the workings of American capitalism as the New Deal did, but they are big bills nonetheless, even after being scaled back to appease moderate Democrats in the Senate who wanted to spend and tax less, angering liberals who wanted to do more, while Republicans want almost nothing to do with the legislation at all. Infrastructure, maybe. Everything else, no way.
So it's the system we have, the system we've lived with. Many times it functions reasonably well. But when we really need vigorous legislative action, it is extraordinarily difficult to get it.
And that's David M. Kennedy. We're honored to have one of the finest American historians on the podcast today. Our conversation is coming up in a bit. Now, as I speak into this microphone, it's not clear when the infrastructure and safety net bills will be voted on. Every day, some new obstacle seems to arise, so keep that in mind as you listen. By the time you listen to this episode, things may have changed a lot since early November, when we're recording it. And that is why we're more interested in the larger issues that are at stake. Why periods of legislative vigor and reform are so rare in our country's history. What kind of country, what kind of democracy do we want to have? Why is one party, in this case the GOP, almost entirely opposed to policies such as paid family leave that are prosaic across the rest of the world? Paid family leave was stripped from Biden's proposal. So was 2 years of free community college, to name another. These are just a few questions to ponder. David M. Kennedy is Professor Emeritus of History at Stanford University. He is the author of Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, 1929 to 1945. It's a marvelous book. It won the Pulitzer Prize and is part of the Oxford History of the United States series. If I had to pick one person with whom to discuss this subject, it would be him. David Kennedy, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks. Happy to be with you.
We're speaking, David Kennedy, right after the White House announced a framework for a $1.8 trillion spending bill. But it's still not clear it's going to pass. It's still not clear if it'll satisfy the more liberal Democrats who wanted more, or the two moderate senators, Manchin and Sinema, who wanted less spending and taxation. According to the New York Times, President Biden told lawmakers before he departed for Europe, "The House and Senate majorities and my presidency will be determined by what happens in the next week." Do you agree with the president's assessment?
Hard to disagree with that. If the Democratic Party has even these razor-thin majorities, that's, of course, a big limiting factor. But if they can't manage to legislate anything of any consequence, they're going to be highly vulnerable in the next electoral round.
And as we know from history, most of the time the incumbent party or the party in the White House, that party loses seats in the midterms, not in Roosevelt's first midterm election, of course. And we're going to get into some of the parallels, some of the differences between then and now. I have been thinking a lot about the New Deal in the context of President Biden's and congressional Democrats' difficulties agreeing to a big bill. And also just this moment, the magnitude of our problems were thrown into relief because of the pandemic. What have you been thinking about historically?
Well, the same as you. The New Deal suggests itself as an obvious point of reference, given Biden's aspirations and ambitions. Another one, of course, is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society legislative package in the 1960s. I think even the plan that now appears to be on its way to some kind of passage, even at that level, I think it's not comparable in its transformative character with what happened in the 1930s or even the 1960s. The price tag of the Biden proposals is, in nominal dollars at least, hugely greater than what happened in the 1930s. But in terms of its potential long-term consequences for really transformative effects on the way people live and how they progress through life and so on, I think it's important, and frankly, I'm all in favor of it. But I just think it does not have the kind of scale of consequence that those New Deal reforms did.
That's right, because Roosevelt was not a profligate spender, either was Congress. It was the reforms, Social Security, some of the other measures that have endured to this day. They're not remembered for spending gobs of money to try to fix problems. They were structural reforms. Do you see it that way as well?
Precisely, and I think you just hit something very important. You said endured to this day. The major transformational changes of the New Deal turned out to be, as far as anything in history is, permanent. We're still living with them. I think of things not only like Social Security, but also changes in the way the federal government stood behind home mortgage purchases, the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, changes in the banking laws, and so on. These have all stayed in place and shaped American life for several generations. Even some of the most ambitious parts of the current proposals have sunset clauses within 2 to 5 years. And it's anybody's guess whether they will endure beyond that. So we're in a much different political culture moment when it's just far more difficult to do things of lasting consequence.
What do you think that is beyond the obvious math in the Senate, which critics say does not really reflect the will of the people?
Well, I think you've mentioned the principal factor. The first level of explanation is the razor-thin margins that the Democratic Party has in both chambers of Congress. And then, of course, add to that the fractionating of the Democratic caucus in the House, not to mention the holdout senators in the Senate. So it's extremely difficult to keep that ungainly vehicle called the Democratic Party together. I'm reminded of the famous quip of Will Rogers way back in the 1920s. He said, "I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." That was true then, and it's, if anything, even more true today. So it's just structurally a very difficult body to herd, a body of cats to herd toward any kind of meaningful destination. So that's number one. And I think that's the most obvious and probably the most dispositive explanation to hand. But there's another deeper factor here that doesn't get a lot of attention in today's media, but it should. And that is we're living with the consequences of a constitutional order that was crafted more than 2 centuries ago in the late 18th century, in that fateful summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, the logic of which was to contain power, to make sure that power was not exercised vigorously and capriciously from the center. The great historian Henry Adams said that the greatest fear that haunted the minds of all the revolutionaries in the 18th century, American colonists who made this country, was the fear of power in whatever form it would manifest itself. Whether in the legislature, the executive, or the tyrant, or the power of the people, raw power, direct democracy, you name the form of power, they were afraid of it. So it used to be when American students studied civics that they learned all about this in grade school classrooms as the notorious system of checks and balances. And at least when I was growing up, that was taught to us as a very benign and positive thing, that we had a system of checks and balances. But we've lived for 2 centuries plus of the Republic's history, and we're living now in a moment when we're really forced to recognize what are the limitations of a system that has so many vetoes built into it. What my colleague at Stanford, Francis Fukuyama, has called a vetoocracy. There are all kinds of points in our system where it is possible to block any meaningful initiative. So it's the system we have, the system we've lived with. Many times it functions reasonably well, but when we really need vigorous legislative action, it is extraordinarily difficult to get it, thanks to the system we have. And in fact, you can count on the fingers of one hand, I'd say, the moments, you don't even need all 5 digits, the moments in American history when we've really had truly transformative political initiatives that came to pass and had lasting consequences. And they all have something in common. One is the Civil War and Reconstruction era. Second is the New Deal period of the 1930s. And the third, maybe, it's a little bit lesser scale, but it's in this family, I think, is the Great Society initiatives that Lyndon Johnson spearheaded in the 1960s. What do all 3 of those moments have in common? They're moments when the executive, the president, had enormous majorities of his own party in both chambers of the legislature. And when, in effect, I'm going to go out on a limb and characterize this in a way that people might object to, but in effect, on those 3 occasions, we functioned politically as a parliamentary democracy, not as a presidential system, where, in effect, the leader of the party was the irresistible leader of the legislature as well as of the executive branch. After the election of 1936, for example, Franklin Roosevelt faced a Senate in which there were only 16 Republicans and 80 Democrats. Wow. Those are the kinds of political margins on which vigorously exercised leadership from the executive branch can really get something done. But those moments are rare in our history. Our normal state, you might say, in our political system, thanks to the architecture devised back there in Philadelphia in 1787, is a system that is full of vetoes and checks and balances, and that was purpose-built to operate that way. So we shouldn't be surprised when it operates that way. It was the intention of the founders.
The founders never said anything about a filibuster, at least not at first. That came about kind of by accident, and if it weren't for the so-called reconciliation process, nothing would get through the Senate. And that's one reason why Democrats are having so much trouble here. They need all 50 senators for that slimmest of majorities to support the Biden.
Exactly. Otherwise, the Senate is and has become, I think, the place where all kinds of legislative initiatives and political initiatives go to die.
Maybe I was naive or foolish, but early this year, I thought that we had reached such a moment where the American people wanted some vigorous government action to ameliorate economic inequality, which is the issue of our time, among others. Climate change is another, as well as ameliorate poverty. The United States is the only country in the G20 that doesn't have paid family leave at the federal level.
And virtually the only country that doesn't have universal health care.
That's right. The New Deal did not accomplish that. Harry Truman tried, but his proposal failed. I suppose Obamacare brought us a little bit closer. Did you believe, as I did in January, that we might be on the verge of something big? I mean, Trump was out, Biden was in. It was like a breath of fresh air. I guess not.
No, frankly, having been marinated in the story of American history for all of my adult lifetime, I am afraid I have to concede that I did not share the optimism and enthusiasm that so many of people I knew expressed at that time. Because, again, to repeat what I just said a moment ago, I'm afraid I'm too well versed in just how easy it is to block any initiatives in our system. So I thought from the outset we'd get something much more modest than what the president campaigned on and what he and many others expected to happen.
So our crisis shall go to waste. I'm not sure if FDR ever used those words, but one observation you made about his 1937 inaugural address has stuck with me. Did he not warn the country that we cannot allow the signs of progress, early signs of recovery out of the Great Depression, to dissuade us from our larger purpose?
Yes, it's an extraordinary address, I think. And in fact, I think you'd ransack the archives of all of presidential addresses and not find anything comparable. Because he says, I think I can quote it nearly exactly, he describes how the country has come out of the very bottommost depths of the Depression since he was inaugurated 4 years earlier in 1933. And he says something to the effect, this is the near quote, these signs of economic progress can be signs of political disaster. In other words, he was afraid that if economic recovery became fully the case, that we would lose the political will to continue what he thought was this yet unfulfilled agenda of the New Deal, which is to bring more economic security to more people. And then he goes into that famous passage, which is so often quoted, I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, and so on, which most casual readers of the address might think he was referring there to the unemployed, the victims of the Great Depression. But if you read the address with any care, he's not talking about them. He thinks the Depression is ending, but he thinks the return of economic prosperity could be portents of political disaster because the full agenda of really bringing everybody into the mainstream of American life to the extent feasible cannot be realized.
So to your earlier point about certain things being overlooked or ignored during this current debate, namely the historical reasons why major changes are so difficult to bring about, the relative lack of structural change in Biden's agenda. But another thing that is being overlooked with the, hyper focus on the Democrats is that not a single Republican supports any of this. Even Republicans who have been praised in the media for defying Donald Trump and condemning Donald Trump's lies about the election. How is it possible that no one in the Republican Party supports any of these things? Proposals that I thought polls indicated Americans wanted, such as paid family leave, help with child care expenses, free community college, which is not going to be in the final bill.
So this is not the first time that major legislation in recent years has been passed with no votes from across the aisle. That was true of the Affordable Care Act in the Obama administration. No Republican votes for that. It was true of the tax legislation in President Trump's first term. No Democratic votes for that. And apparently we'll get no Republican votes for this package of legislation, at least for the Build Back Better portion of it. Maybe the infrastructure bill will be a different story. This is indicative of a really stark reality of our time, that there are virtually no crossover votes in the Congress. And by extension or analogy or relatedly, We see more and more so-called landslide county votes out there in the country, where any individual county's electoral margin can now be 20 to 50% for one party or the other. It tends to be mostly the case in red counties, but not entirely. So as the political scientists have been instructing us in recent years, our two political parties have sorted. So the distribution of political preferences and program preferences and policy preferences and so on in the public at large, taken in the aggregate, doesn't look terribly different than what it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But the fact is that those people with those varying preferences have sorted themselves out into two major parties, and they are at loggerheads. And there's just appears to be no bridges across which they can reach out to each other.
Well, that's a sign that the bonds of our republic are fraying, isn't it?
I'm afraid that's correct. And if you really want to go deep down into the wells of pessimism here, you could add to this, not only is there a kind of paralysis at the most consequential level of political action, legislation, and so on, but out there where the fields of the republic roll on into the night, as Scott Fitzgerald described it, we don't trust one another as citizens the way we once did. The polling data about this are truly depressing. That you can chart back into the 1970s, in some cases even back to the 1950s, not only what degree of confidence as citizens we have in our institutions, that's one story, it's a very depressing story. We've lost confidence in most of them, rather dramatically. But we've lost confidence in one another. We don't trust one another. And in fact, the most depressing part of all of that array of data is it appears to be the case that the younger we are, the more mistrustful we are. The millennials show up in the polling data as the people who have lost the most degree of confidence in our institutions and who are most mistrustful of their fellow citizens.
That's understandable given, depending on how old a millennial may be, they've lived through two economic shocks, the '08 crash and then the pandemic. They've seen pretty much nothing but war, or what's called the global war on terrorism, their entire adult lives, an opioid epidemic. So from their standpoint, institutions have failed them, including the news media, of which I am a member.
Well, I'm afraid that's an irreducible set of facts that goes a long way to explaining things, that our institutions have underperformed, to put it a little bit antiseptically, maybe too charitably. On the other hand, you might think that suffering through a widely shared crisis like the pandemic might have conduced to more feelings of solidarity and a reminder that we all sail in the same ship and we have things in common and we have to join hands and fight this thing together. But for reasons that historians will probably probe for generations to come, that is not the way the pandemic has landed in the public mind. It has served more to divide us than unite us, which, in the face of it at least, is rather mysterious.
So the crisis, I'll keep repeating that over and over again, shall go to waste. Back to Roosevelt's time, a dear friend of mine who's been on this podcast a couple of times, a retired historian, Paul McBride, a professor emeritus at Ithaca College, where I attended school in the 1990s. He's also an admirer of your work, David Kennedy. And when I told him I was going to be interviewing you, he shared some of his thoughts about the parallels between then and now. And he said one thing I may want to raise with you is that when Roosevelt was campaigning and then in the early years of his administration, he did not have Herbert Hoover holding rallies claiming that he actually won the election of 1932. And also the Congress as well. Roosevelt had allies in the Republican Party, at least for some pieces of his legislation, his experimentation. The geographic makeup of Congress, the ideological makeup of Congress was so much different. Can you talk a little bit about that? So for listeners who have only known this simple dichotomy, left versus right, today, who may not understand the dynamics in Congress in the 1930s.
Well, as you say, it was a wholly different landscape in the 1930s compared to today, both with respect to the kind of institutional or architectural composition of the Congress and of the political parties. And I dare say, although, again, this is one of these more elusive points that's harder to really nail down, but I think that the country's psychology, its state of mind, was different. And let me expand on that latter point just briefly. Again, we have pretty good polling data as well as some pretty good social psychology research from the 1930s about how people reacted to the fact that the economic system had collapsed all around them and they'd gone unemployed in massive numbers. 13 million unemployed people in 1933, 25% of the workforce. And lest we forget, 25% of the workforce understates, from our perspective, what that meant, because virtually no married women worked. 25% of the workforce meant that in most households, the overwhelming majority of households, there was only one breadwinner, the male. That guy went unemployed. The household, the family, had no alternative wage earner there. That would not be the case today. So massive unemployment. And probably the best exploration of the psychological implications of that is a really wonderful book published in 1940 by a young woman social psychologist in Chicago by the name of Mira Komarovsky. And the title of the book tells us something very essential about the whole argument of the book. Its title is The Unemployed Man and His Family, a reminder of the demography of the workforce. The core finding of that book, and corroborated by all kinds of other observation at the time, is that the individual who went unemployed, his overwhelming automatic reflex reaction was to feel guilt and shame that he had somehow morally failed, let down himself, his family, and so on. In retrospect, it seems natural for us to say, if we could time warp back there and talk to those unemployed men, hey, you guys, come on. It's not like 13 million people suddenly lost their moral fiber overnight. This is a systemic crisis. It's the system that is broken down, not your moral character. And it behooves you to make common cause in the political arena and the economic arena to counterpunch to this thing. Today, that would be our natural reaction, that if we have a systemic breakdown, we don't feel individually guilty or ashamed. We understand at some crude level, at least, that there is a systemic problem. So that's a big difference between then and now. But an additional difference is we have difficulty making common cause. We might recognize the common causes of the problem, or that the problem has a systemic cause, but we have difficulty actually binding ourselves together in a way that makes for an effective counterpunch.
I think you've described it as a reverse psychology, that in America, if you're successful, it was because you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, you were an individual, you had know-how and skills, and you made it. Therefore, if you fail, it must have been something you did wrong.
That's right. What you just said is the dark underside of our national mythology of individualism. We take pride in the way we have over many, many, many generations liberated the energies and the genius of individuals and opened the pathway to achievement and accomplishment and social mobility and so on. But what we fail to recognize most times is that there is a dark underbelly to that vaunted psychology. And you just described it. If we don't achieve all those things, and social mobility, achievement, accomplishments, bettering our lives and so on, we can only blame ourselves. Now, there's a certain truth to that, let's be fair. But the negative implications of that psychology can also be a huge political impediment to actually taking effective collective action when the times call for it.
That's true. Individuals do screw up. During the New Deal years, people were ashamed to get relief, even if they needed it. They didn't want to go on the dole or go collect whatever offering was available locally or federally.
Well, that's correct. And Franklin Roosevelt said things both publicly and privately that could have come out of the mouth of Herbert Hoover about how the dole, actually just giving people income or charity, was demeaning and morally degrading. There's very little blue water between him and Herbert Hoover when it comes to assessment of what the psychological and moral implications of the so-called dole were. And indeed, I think that was an accurate perception. People, by and large, don't want to be doled to. They want to be given a helping hand to get themselves on their feet and do what they can for themselves. So I think that's a pretty elemental and persistent, stubborn element of human psychology. It's with us still. So it's why, for example, in the New Deal era, Roosevelt at first put in place various programs, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, for example, Civil Works Administration, which did essentially hand out groceries and money to people. But they quickly figured out that this was demeaning. People resented it. So they went to work programs where they tried to make the government the employer of last resort, most famously in programs like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The idea was to give people a chance to actually work for their income instead of just simply receiving it as a handout from the government. I think that was not only politically feasible, or almost the only feasible way to continue these programs, but it was morally and psychologically, I think, quite insightful and correct.
And they were grasping for answers to some extent, weren't they? Meaning we today have a better understanding of what our problems are, the effects of globalization and so forth, than did the decision makers during Roosevelt's time, during the capital G, capital D Great Depression. I mean, it took some time to fully understand what was happening to the country, didn't it?
Well, yes, and that's why I've always been a little less harsh on Herbert Hoover than many other historians have been. Because it's easy to imagine that Hoover and the people around him well into the Depression, I'd say well into 1931 at least, thought they were facing just another of the very familiar downswings in the business cycle, and that policies that have been more or less effective in reversing those kinds of downswings in the past would work again. And it's only at some ill-defined date in 1931, I think, that it becomes fair to talk about the black swan singular character of this particular downswing in the business cycle. So it gets the appellation ever after of the capital G, capital D Great Depression, as you just said. But nobody in the early years of this event, as it was coming over the horizon, understood it to be of that magnitude or velocity or scale or duration. So I think we need to be a little bit more charitable toward Hoover, who clearly was inadequate in his response to this. But he was inadequate in part because it was impossible for him or anyone else to understand the full scale of what they were facing. There are issues today that have comparable kinds of characteristics, it seems to me. Climate change is one of them, maybe the single most important one. And some people, I think, are trying strenuously to convince the rest of us of the scale and possibly the velocity of climate change and its long-term effects. But it's the kind of thing for which there's no precedent in human experience. Nobody's lived through a climate change crisis on this magnitude, at least not within historical memory. So again, it's kind of understandable why so many people have difficulty fully grasping what the implications of this might be. And I think future generations, if they have to document the sad story of our failure to act in time, which I'm afraid is a candidate story that historians will tell a century or two from now, I hope they'll have the empathy with people of our time in the difficulty we've had really understanding just how serious this matter is.
On that note, not to digress, I did read a headline today about the number of new coal-fired power plants being built in Asia because of the growing economy. There's a demand for cheaper energy. Back to the New Deal and another potential parallel to today. The New Deal, did it not, gave birth to, I don't want to call it the modern conservative movement of Barry Goldwater, William F. Buckley, Ronald Reagan. But the seeds were planted then of a conservatism opposed to the expansion of government programs. And it appears most, if not all, Republicans in Congress today continue to share that ideology.
Yeah, when we talk about modern conservatism, of course, there are various phases of that, and we should be clear what we're talking about at any given time. But if there's any constant element in the nature of conservatism from the 1930s forward, it is the deep concern about the nature of government as a player in the economy and society more broadly. That is the one thread that runs through whatever phase of conservatism we're talking about, whether it's Eisenhower conservatism, Rockefeller conservatism, Buckley conservatism, Goldwater conservatism, Trump-Bannon conservatism, what have you. The fact is that under the pressure of events and reality, it seems to me, beginning not exactly the New Deal, you could argue begins even earlier in the so-called progressive period, but substantially advancing in the New Deal period, government becomes a bigger factor in the life of the economy, in the life of society, and even the life of individuals through programs, not least of all, like Social Security. So in a sense, you might say the conservative movement is logically focused on that. They haven't made that up. That's a reality, that there's more government and more government presence in the life of society than there used to be. And we've long feared central government power, going all the way back again to that Constitutional Convention in 1787. So this is, you might say, a stubborn, persistent feature of our political culture over 2 centuries, but it's taken on a more focused character, it seems to me, in the last century since the Great Depression.
Well, before we wrap up, one more point about that idea. While the Republican Party is dead set against expanding the safety net as Biden wants to, I'm no social scientist, done no research on this, just my own observations from reading the news and social media. Young people want these things. They want higher wages. They want better government support for child care and family leave. They want higher taxes on millionaires and billionaires. So I guess I'm puzzled as to why the Republican Party seems to have no positive agenda for the country that reflects the wishes of some of their own voters, too. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that before I get to my last question.
Well, I think there's some elements of mystery in here. I'm not sure it's completely true that the Republican Party or people in the Republican Party have no agenda whatsoever. I think it's not well articulated and hasn't dominated the headlines recently, that's for sure. But I think there are people in the Republican Party, I presume, who are trying to think of systematic ways to address these issues in ways that are compatible with their own political values and the preferences of their own party. So I think there is some of that. But there's something else here that one needs to, again, not a happy thing to contemplate, but you may well be right that young people have a greater preference for these kinds of things than older people and are eager for policies that will improve wages, especially entry-level wages, and help them establish families in the early stages of life through childcare support and so on and so forth. That may all be true, but it's also true that young people vote in lesser proportions than do people further along in the life cycle. So if we could somehow convince young people that they, of all people, have the greatest stake in these matters, because they're going to live with them the longest, for better or worse, the consequences of present day issues and policies will be visited upon them longer than old folks who are going to pass from the scene pretty soon. If they could only grasp that fact, you remind me, I once took a group of students to visit the Speaker of the House of Parliament in London. And he asked them right off the bat, as soon as they came into his chamber, where he was being invested with ermine robes and so on. They were all dressed in shorts and sandals. Quite a scene. He asked them how many had voted in the last election in the United States. All of them were eligible to vote. And only 2 or 3 out of about 30 raised their hands. And he proceeded to give them a lecture, the likes of which I think none of them had ever heard before. And he said, men have died for your right to vote. And if you don't exercise it, you dishonor them, you dishonor all the basic principles on which your country has been founded. Well, that's pretty serious stuff, but boy, it is to be taken seriously. And somehow I think we'd all be better off. We could better educate the young about the implications of the life situation they're in, including its political dimensions. And if we can get them to the polls in an informed manner and in greater numbers, I think we'd all be better off.
The word unprecedented is thrown around a lot about how divided we are and the alternate realities people are living in. Obviously, the 1850s and the run-up to Civil War, pretty bad. I don't think we're quite that bad. But whether we can compare it or not, we are living with these two competing ideas of freedom that seem to permeate almost every aspect of our politics. I like to think that our society is far more nuanced than that. If you ever take a road trip across the country, you would find people that have different views on different issues, and then we're not all monoliths. But doesn't it seem like we are living in a simple dichotomy? To some people, wearing a mask is a form of freedom because you can avoid catching the coronavirus, and to others, wearing a mask is tyranny, to use one example.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary. I hesitate to use the word unprecedented as you do, because if you ransack around long enough in the dustbins of history, you might find some precedent for all kinds of things. It's not that we have any greater degree of difference among us. We could argue that at length, but we have greater difficulty finding ways to reconcile those differences and to identify where the ground might be that we could stand on together. And that has something to do with the sorting of our citizens into the two parties. So there's less diversity of opinion within each respective party, and therefore less ability to reach across the aisle. It also has something to do, and I hope you won't take this as a comment on your own chosen profession, but it has something to do with the fragmentation of the media.
I agree.
In the last generation or two, which has to do, again, with technology. But we now have so many sources of news or alleged news, let's say, I'm trying to avoid the term fake news, so many sources of information about the society around us in the world. And if you combine that simple technological fact with what the behavioral economists have recently instructed us about something called confirmation bias, that is the tendency of all of us to give more credence to those ideas that are the most compatible with our already held ideas, to confirm our view of the world. Put those two things together, and we have a society in which people stand in all these separated silos of information and worldview and perspective. And it's the devil's own question how we can once again create a fabric of reliable information, verifiable information that we can all agree fits the facts and go forward on that basis. It's just a technologically driven fact of the news environment we live in that we don't have that kind of media environment today.
David M. Kennedy, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
So maybe there is no positive outcome here. I mean, we can debate it for fun, but it could be that our democracy, the bonds of our republic, will continue to fray. As some on the left have pointed out, what is more important to the future of our society, preserving the filibuster or passing important legislation, whether it's paid family leave or a higher minimum wage? What an honor to have David M. Kennedy on the show today. Do yourself a favor and pick up his Freedom from Fear, the American People in Depression and War. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the conscience of an anti-Trump conservative. We'll be joined by former Virginia Congresswoman Barbara Comstock to discuss the future of the GOP as her state elects a Republican as its next governor and as Congress continues to investigate the January 6 riot. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.